The Age of Railroads. Railroads were one of the most notable advancements of the Industrial Revolution. Although railroads influenced the growth of towns and communities, the unchecked power of the railroad companies led to widespread abuses that spurred citizens to demand federal regulation of the industry. At the start of the Civil War, the nation had about 30,000 miles of track, but by 1890, that figure was 6 times greater. The Central and Union Pacific Railroad employed thousands of Chinese and Irish immigrants desperate for work after the Civil War to lay tracks across the treacherous terrain while enduring Native American attacks. Accidents and disease disabled and killed thousands of these men each year. In 1888, when the first railroad statistics were published, the casualties totaled more than 2,000 employees killed and 20,000 injured. At this point, each community still operated on its own time, but in 1869, Professor C. F. Dowd proposed that the Earth's surface should be divided into 24 time zones, one for each hour of the day. The U.S. would contain 4 of these time zones: Eastern, Central, Mountain, and Pacific. On November 18, 1883, railroad crews in towns across the nation synchronized their watches. In 1884, an international conference set up worldwide time zones that incorporated railroad times, but the U.S. Congress didn't officially adopt railroad time as standard for the nation until 1918. By linking previously isolated cities, towns, and settlements, the railroads promoted trade and interdependency. Individual towns began to specialize in particular products which boost their economies.
In 1880, George M. Pullman built a factory and town for manufacturing sleepers and other railroad cars on the Illinois prairie.
The people that lived in these residences had clean brick houses and apartments with at least one window in every room.
Pullman created his company town out of desire for control and profit. In 1864, stockholders in Union Pacific Railroad formed a construction company called Credit Mobiler. The stockholders gave this company a contract to lay track at 2 to 3 times the actual cost and pocketed the profits. Pacific had taken up to $23 million in stocks, bonds, and cash. The Grangers began demanding governmental control over the railroad industries. Farmers were upset by the misuse of government land grants, which railroads sold to other businesses rather than to settlers, as the government intended. In 1871, Illinois authorized a commission to establish maximum freight and passenger rates and prohibit discrimination. Grangers throughout the West, Midwest, and East-West convinced state legislators to pass similar laws called the Granger Laws. In 1877, in the case of Munn v. Illinois, the Supreme Court upheld the Granger Laws by a vote of 7-2. The states thus won the right to regulate railroads for the benefit of farmers and consumers. Congress passed the Interstate Commerce Act in 1877. This act established the right of federal government to supervise railroad activities and establish a 5-member Interstate Commerce Commission for that purpose, but not until 1906, during the presidency of Theodore Roosevelt, did the ICC gain the power it needed to be efficient. Corporate abuses, mismanagement, overbuilding, and competition pushed many railroads to the brink of bankruptcy. The Panic of 1893 was the worst depression up to that time. 600 banks and 15,000 businesses had failed. By 1894, 1/4 of the nation's railroads had been taken over by financial companies, and by 1895, 4 million people had lost their jobs. As the 20th century approached, 7 powerful companies had swayed over 2/3 of the nation's railroad tracks. Big business. Andrew Carnegie was one of the first industrial mongrels to make his own fortune. He started off as a superintendent in a Pennsylvania railroad until his boss gave him an opportunity to buy stock. He entered the steel business in 1873, and by 1899 his steel company manufactured more steel than all factories in Great Britain.
You might be asking yourself, how did Carnegie's business become such a success? This is due to his business strategies. First, he searched for ways to make better products more cheaply, then attracted talented people by offering them stock in the company. Lastly, he tried to control as much of the steel industry as he could by vertical and horizontal integration. There are other theories why businesses are successful, like social Darwinism, a theory that explains a process of natural selection, weeded out less suited individuals, enabled the best adapted to survive. This was linked to the evolution of human society by an English philosopher, Herbert Spencer.
Natural law was endured by business leaders, but most entrepreneurs did everything they could to buy out competitors by mergers and have complete control to potentially create a monopoly. John D. Rockefeller, who established the Standard Oil Company, took a different approach to mergers.
Although trusts were not legal mergers, to gain total control of the oil industry, he joined with competing companies in trust agreements, which meant they had to turn their stocks over to a group of trustees. Within a decade, it controlled 90% of the refining business. Government worried that expanding corporations would stifle free competition, so they made it illegal to form a trust that interfered with free trade between states or with other countries with the Sherman Antitrust Act. The Supreme Court threw out a majority of the federal government cases brought against trusts. Eventually, the government stopped trying to enforce the Sherman Act, and the consolidation of business continued.
Laborers joined together in unions to try and improve their life.
Harsh working conditions included a 7-day work week, 12 or more hours a day, no vacations, sick leave, unemployment compensation, or reimbursement for injuries. Injuries were very common. Wages were very low and most families could not survive. Child laborers often forfeited their schools to take on a full-time job.
The National Labor Union was formed in 1866 by ironworker William H. Silves, and it was the first large-scale organization for laborers. It focused on linking existing local unions. Two kinds of unions were created by laborers. First, craft unionism, which was a skilled worker from one or more trades, and industrial unionism, which included all laborers, skilled or not skilled. The American Federation of Labor was an example of a craft union.
Samuel Gompers was the president of the AFL. It focused on collective bargaining or negotiation between representatives of labor and management to reach written agreements or wages, houses, and working conditions. At the Haymarket Affair, people gathered at Haymarket Square to protest police brutality, where someone threw a bomb into the police line. The police began to fire, and after no one discovered who threw the bomb.
During the Panic of 1893 and the Economic Depression, the Pullman Company laid off more than 3,000 of its employees and cut the wages of the rest. Workers took home less than $6 a week. A strike was called in 1894 when Eugene Debs asked for arbitration, but Pullman refused to negotiate. Women formed unions for better working conditions, equal pay for equal work, and to end child labor. Mary Harris Jones was one of the predominant organizers. She organized the United. The more powerful the unions became, the more employers began to fear them. But legal limitations made it more and more difficult for unions to be effective. The immense industrial boom was due to a wealth of natural resources, government support for businesses, and a growing urban population. The Biesmeyer process was developed independently by a British manufacturer, Harry Biesmeyer, and American iron maker William Kelly around 1850 and became widely used. The technique involved injecting air into molten iron to remove iron and other impurities. By 1880, this process was used for 90% of the nation's steel.
This new steel could be used for thousands of miles of railroad track.
In 1859, Edwin L. Drake used a steam engine to drill for oil near Pennsylvania. This started an oil boom in Kentucky, Ohio, Illinois, Indiana, and later Texas. Interesting fact! Did you know that gasoline was originally a byproduct of refining kerosene and was thrown away?
Yeah.
Thomas Edison perfected the light and invented an entire system of producing electrical power, called the transformer. In 1867, Alexander Graham Bell and Thomas Watson invented the telephone. Christopher Sholes invented the typewriter in 1867, which changed the work world along with the telephone. It created new jobs for women and changed the office world.
The Industrial Revolution was a time for growth and change that boosted the American economy to being a world superpower.